With the new Death Guard Codex bringing some improved rules to the Possessed, I thought that now would be an excellent time to add some to fight alongside my own Plague Marines. However, as there aren't any official Death Guard Possessed, and the generic ones don't look great, I thought I would have a go at kitbashing some of my own. As a basis for this conversion, I settled on the Putrid Blight Kings. They're already Nurgle affiliated, they are big, they are bloated, and they already come with a bunch of cool mutations. Now you may remember that I have tackled Death Guard Possessed in a live stream before, where I built this prototype here. Now this particular model used a regular Plague Marine as the basis for the conversion. While I was able to integrate a number of mutations into the model, I felt that the end result looked too similar to a regular old Plague Marine and wouldn't stand out quite as much as using a Putrid Blight King would. So, with my starting kit decided, I could go ahead and start removing all the components to build one of these Putrid Blight Kings, with the exception of his head. Once these were removed, I removed any sprue tabs and cleaned up the mold lines. As the Putrid Blight Kings are built for Age of Sigmar, one of my biggest challenges in building this conversion was to give it that 40k spin and to help tie the miniature in to its former Plague Marine roots. My first attempt to resolve this saw me using some components from the Mark III Space Marine kit. Most Death Guard models sport a mixture of Mark II and Mark III armors, so using components from that particular Horus Heresy kit was perfect. I began by replacing the lower right leg of the Blight King with some power armor. I started by sawing through the armored leg, just behind the knee. I didn't intend to use the knee pad, so I sawed straight through this until the lower leg was separated. Similarly, I then began to remove the Blight King's right foot, using my saw to cut between the top of the right boot and the armoured knee pad. Now both of these cuts had been made, I was able to compare the armoured leg to the rest of the body to see exactly where I needed to make adjustments. I began to make a series of trims and cuts with my knife. I removed the remaining half of the knee pad from the armoured leg and cut back any remaining parts of the boot from the Blight King's leg. I made frequent comparisons between the two parts to ensure that I was cutting away at the correct locations. This was continued until the two halves of the leg could fit together without any large gaps, at which point they were glued together. The great thing about Death Guard models is that any gaps you have can easily be filled in with some putty to appear like protruding flesh, which is exactly what I did later on. In the next step, I continued to add Mark III armor plates. As I had already used part of the leg, I decided to cannibalize this further to separate one of the thigh plates. I used my saw once again to cut directly behind the plate in order to separate it from the rest of the thigh. Once done, I used my knife to clean up and help to thin out the plate somewhat. However, before I could attach this plate to the model, I continued to assemble the Blight King's torso. With this done, I now had a better idea of exactly where I could attach this extra plate without it interfering with the rest of the model's assembly. The next piece of armor that I wanted to add to the Blight King was a Plague Marine shoulder. This would be placed over the right shoulder where the existing armor plate would normally sit, but to allow the new shoulder to fit, I needed to make some trims. I took the component that made up the back of the arm and started off with my clippers to remove the more prominent details from that shoulder. Following this, I used my knife to further remove the sculpted on shoulder pad, smoothing it out bit by bit before I glued it to the rest of the torso. Now that I had the shoulder pad in place, I could compare the Plague Marine shoulder pad. It still didn't quite fit, which meant I needed further trims to both sides of the shoulder. Like before, I made frequent comparisons to the parts before finally gluing them together. You're free to use whatever shoulder pads you have spare here, including the generic Mark III ones too, although adding a little damage to these otherwise clean components will help with that overall Nurgle appearance. For the next step, I continued my task of attaching bits of Mark III and Plague Marine armor to my Possessed, and this time I turned to the helmet. Both the helmet and the neck needed some drastic trimming back in order for them to be stuck together. I started with the helmet and clipped away the neck from beneath it and also parts of the back of the helmet too. The neck also needed a few trims and I used my knife, but as always, I frequently checked the two components and how they were fitted together to make sure that my trims were in the right place and in the right amounts. Once I was happy with how the head was fitting, I could glue it to the neck. I did have a gap beneath the chin, but this would be solved later on. The final piece of Plague Marine to cannibalize and attach the possessed came from a forearm. Like with the earlier thigh, I just needed the front plate, so I broke out my saw and started sawing beneath the plate, starting at the wrist and working my way back towards the elbow. After the forearm plate was liberated from the arm, I used my knife and file to smooth out and trim so that it could be properly attached to the Blight King's right forearm. At this point, I basically had a Blight King who was dressed up as a Plague Marine. He had some mutations already, like the tentacle coming from the arm and the giant gaping maw in his stomach, but this was supposed to be a possessed. He needed more mutations. For these, I turned to one of my favourite plastic kit manufacturers, Wargames Atlantic, and grabbed myself one of their spider kits. You get a whole bunch of spiders in this kit, and with them, a whole bunch of giant creepy insect legs that would fit perfectly in with my Nurgle theme. So I grabbed myself a few of the legs from that sprue. The legs come with ball joints at the end of them, but as I wanted to have these protruding from the possessed marine's flesh, I need to first flatten them out. I did this with my clippers and used a file to help flatten out things again. The problem I now had was getting a good bond with such a small surface to glue with. Luckily, the leg was just thick enough to use pinning to reinforce the bond. So I began by drilling holes into the leg and then into the location where I intended to attach the leg to. With the holes drilled, I took some 1mm steel fluoresce wire, added a little superglue to the end and placed this into the leg. It gave it a little time to dry before clipping the wire down so that just a few millimeters were left protruding. A little more superglue was added to this protruding wire and then this was placed into the hole in the shoulder, completing the bond. I repeated this process a few times until I had a number of legs protruding from the torso. At this stage, I had a model that looked much more demonically possessed than he did before. The only problem left to solve now was some of the gaps in the armour and the abrupt transitions from fatty skin to spider leg. Both of these issues would be solved with Putty. I chose to use Procreate here, but green stuff can be used too. I cut off a small amount of each colour, mixed them together and rolled out the mixture into a thin sausage. This was cut down to about a couple of centimetres before being placed beneath the helmet. With a sharp pointed sculpting tool, I then pressed this sausage into and around the neck at each of its ends. This created the appearance of heavy bloated skin that was stretching and sagging. It also helped to blend the putty into the rest of the neck and the shoulders. I remember to always use wet tools when handling putty. It helps prevent that annoying problem where your beautifully sculpted piece decides to attach itself to your tool rather than the model. After the first fat fold, I still had a little more room to work with, so added a second fold of skin using the exact same processes as before. Finally, I looped putty sausages around the bases of the erupting spider legs. These were then blended into the surrounding skin at the bottom, which resulted in a less abrupt and more natural looking protrusion. If of course you consider giant bug legs erupting from your flesh to be in any way natural. And with that, I was done. The possessed just needed to be painted and based to match my other Death Guard, which left me with this. And here we have the finished Death Guard possessed, painted in a grimy Blanchitsu style to match my other Death Guard. By opting to use the Blight Kings as the basis of this conversion rather than a regular Plague Marine, I've been able to create something that helps to stand out amongst the other units in my army. But by incorporating aspects of regular Plague Marines, I've helped to bridge the gap between the original fantasy role of the kit and its sci-fi implementation. And to see how this guy compares in size and appearance to my other units, here he is with a regular Plague Marine. Now normally in these conversions, I just build a single model. Most of the time these miniatures are just proof of concepts, one-off examples that I use to demonstrate a process. However, this particular conversion was going to be implemented into my fledgling Death Guard army, so I took things a little further and built up a whole squad. So here we have the possessed that I built in this video, alongside 4 others that I built using the exact same concepts and techniques, albeit applied in slightly different ways. So if you enjoyed this Death Guard kit bash, then please do let me know, along with any other ideas you might have for other Death Guard, Chaos or other 40k based conversions you would like to see me tackle in the future. So the final thing to say is a massive thank you to all of my supporters. Whether you support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use any of my affiliates links, your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all of those relevant links. And so until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.